This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's great political film is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which has often come top of lists of the greatest films of all time, not just the greatest political films, but the greatest films. It's not a film to everyone's taste, but it is many people's favourite movie of all. And one of those people is Citizen Trump, and that's where I'm going to start. I want to start talking about Citizen Kane by talking about Donald Trump, because he has gone on the record stating that it's his favourite film. It's true that during his time in the White House, it was rumoured that the film that he watched over and over again and made people watch with him was Sunset Boulevard, which is a whole other podcast, probably a whole other course of therapy. But officially, Trump's number one movie is Citizen Kane. And in 2002, the filmmaker, the documentarian Errol Morris, made a very short film. It's just a few minutes long. You can watch it on YouTube with Donald Trump, in which Trump talks about what he likes about Citizen Kane and how he understands the film. And it's really interesting. And the things that Trump says about the film are interesting. They're not just revealing about Trump, though they are. They are also interesting about the film. One thing that Trump says is that when asked to summarize what Citizen Kane is about, he summarizes it in one word. He says that it is a film about accumulation. That's what Charles Foster Kane does in this film. He accumulates things. Not acquisition, certainly not wealth creation. Accumulation, which is a word that has mindless connotations to it. There's something compulsive about accumulation, and there certainly is in this film. Something deeply compulsive, out of control, about Kane's desire to have more and more stuff, from works of art to tat, and from newspapers to people whom he treats as things. All of this extensions of himself, this mindless accumulation. It's also interestingly the word that Marxists often use to describe what's wrong with capitalism. It's mindless accumulation. Rosa Luxemburg's great book was called The Accumulation of Capital. They can't help it. It's a compulsion. They have to have more of the thing, not only that they don't ultimately need, but that will destroy them, as indeed this mindless accumulation destroys Kane. Whether Trump recognizes himself in this as an accumulator of things and people rather than an acquirer, even acquisition has a more purposive quality to it than accumulation, and certainly I don't think Trump is a wealth creator any more than Kane was. So whether there's recognition in this description, I don't know, but it is insightful. The other thing that Trump says about this film, when asked to capture its essence, is that for him it is, I quote, the story of a great rise and a modest fall. Kane has a great rise, but then the fall is modest. And Trump says this with some affection, maybe even some recognition. So this is 2002. Trump is a long way from being a politician. In Morris's film, the little blurb just describes him as businessman. The Apprentice hasn't even appeared on TV yet. He's just Donald Trump, whatever that celebrity was before he became whatever he is now. And Trump seems to find this appealing, this story arc, the great rise and the modest fall. But it's also baffling to read the film that way because it really isn't that story. Orson Welles himself in 1941 gave an interview in which he went out of his way to insist this is not the story of the rise and fall of a businessman, because he doesn't have a rise. He inherits all this wealth. He doesn't make any of this money for himself. He buys up newspapers, and then he buys up things, and he buys up people. But Wells said this is a story of failure, of someone who is given this stuff on a plate and squanders it and destroys himself in the process. It's not a great rise and a modest fall, no rise, and the fall in many ways is total. The only way that Trump's reading makes sense is if you think that the primary commodity in which Charles Foster Kane is trading is celebrity, or maybe even notoriety. If you read the film that way, then it is the story of a self-made man. Kane inherits his wealth, and it's passed to him effectively when he's 25. And he uses it not to make more money, as far as we can tell, and not to do anything particularly creative in a financial sense or an economic sense, but to acquire power and influence, but above all, to acquire name recognition. He becomes a very famous person. When he's 25, he's not famous. He's just another wealthy trust fund kid. But he makes himself Charles Foster Kane, the man about whom in the film songs are sung. And he's almost a folk hero and a folk villain. And seen in the currency of fame, then this is the story of a great rise and a modest fall, because the film begins with Kane's death. And after his death, we get the newsreel version of his life. So you get a short version of Kane's life before you get the longer version, the inside story. But the public story we get of his life, which is produced on his death, still treats him as a very, very famous person. That's why there is a newsreel film about him. And the newsreel story, which is very condensed, is a story of all sorts of ups and downs. It's a roller coaster ride, his life. Successes and failures, notoriety, scandal. The implication is that he's more or less ruined by the Great Depression. Not quite, but he nearly loses it all. His politics are all over the place. We see in the newsreel a little bit of footage of Charles Foster Kane on the balcony with Adolf Hitler. He lurches from a kind of progressive populist to clearly someone towards the end of his life who was flirting with fascism. It's a roller coaster, but the thing that seems, according to the newsreel version, to have remained relatively constant is his notoriety. He is clearly, on his death, not as well known as he was at the height of his powers, but it is only a modest fall. On any other measure, his life is a catastrophe. He fails at almost everything that he does, and the things that he successively accumulates bring him no joy, but also in the end do not serve his purposes. And he finishes his life living in his vast, miserable mansion, Xanadu, which, as we see after his death, is basically a wreck, surrounded by the empty relics of a life that has failed on almost every term. Only if fame is the commodity is this life a success. Again, I don't know what that says about Donald Trump, but it seems to me only a plausible reading, essentially, if you have a Trumpian view of what really counts. And Donald Trump has gone on the record as saying that what really counts is name recognition. The newsreel version of Kane's life also has a Trumpy feel to it because it tells this story of a kind of roller coaster in which there are these lurches of fortune. But when we see the life from the inside, when we see how Kane lived it, it doesn't feel like that. So the great crisis in the newsreel of the Depression and the potential loss of all his businesses barely features in the story of his life. The financial twists and turns along the way, the state of his fortune barely features. We see the life as the life of someone who is primarily interested in self-projection. And in those terms, he's almost insulated from what the outside world sees as a great, lurching, chaotic life. Because there is something steady about his ability to project himself on the stage of public opinion. And that also feels a bit like Trump, who, after all, has had a checkered business career and weirdly, and I think it still remains one of the deep mysteries of Donald Trump, has been impervious to much of that failure. Why? Well, maybe if the commodity you're trading in is notoriety, that's not the failure that counts. But the other reason why Trump's reading of the film is so odd is that the story arc is nothing like a rise and fall. The thing that is lost in this film is lost at the beginning. And the film is, on almost any reading, I think, the story of the life of a man who is searching for something that he lost at the start of his life. So famously, the mystery that the story structure of Citizen Kane sets up at the beginning and is only resolved right at the end in effectively the final shot, not quite, but almost the final shot, is the question of what his dying words, or actually word, meant. The last thing Kane says on his deathbed is Rosebud. And it's known to the wider world that this was the last thing he said, so it becomes a symbol of the mystery of his life. Does it explain why a man like this lived the way that he did? Does it explain this life of mindless accumulation, this life of roller coaster lurches of fortune, but also a kind of imperviousness to that lurching fortune? And a journalist is tasked with trying to uncover this mystery. What or who was Rosebud? And the film follows his search for this. That's how we get the story of Kane's life, told by various witnesses along the way. His second wife, one of his business partners, the man who managed his money, and so on. And at the end, we discover, plot spoiler alert, but I think this is so well known now that it almost doesn't count as a plot spoiler. Rosebud turns out to be his childhood sled that we see at the very beginning of the film when we see him as a child. And he's playing in the snow and he's holding a sled. And it turns out at the end that it's called Rosebud, and it clearly symbolizes something for him about his childhood. But that's not the mystery at the heart of this film. The mystery at the heart of this film has something to do with Kane's childhood, but it's why his mother chooses to send him away from home. And that's the reason he's clinging to Rosebud at the end, because Rosebud is the sled that he had and is holding at the moment that he's told by his mother, and indeed by a lawyer who's been brought in to take him away from home, that he's going to be leaving his mother and his father and the home in which, as far as we can tell, he seems to be happy, for a different kind of life. He's going to be brought up as a wealthy person, and he's going to be given a different kind of education, and he's going to be taken away from his parental home. The mystery is why his mother chooses to send him away, and it's never fully explained. What has happened is that she has suddenly become spectacularly rich. We are told that she was given a tract of land, and it turns out that on that tract of land there is a gold mine, and now she is, by implication, one of the wealthiest people in America. And her fortune will be his fortune. He seems to be an only child. So suddenly the question is, for this 8-year-old boy, how to bring up a child who has gone from being an ordinary kid to someone with a vast fortune which will come to him at some point. And she brings in a lawyer to take him away, and she more or less hands him over to the care of this lawyer, or the trust fund that this lawyer represents. There is something very Dickensian about the start of Kane's story, and Orson Welles was a lover of Dickens and deeply influenced by Dickens. And there is a depiction of a scene, it looks quite Dickensian, in which this mysterious lawyer figure appears in the life of this child. The child is introduced to him on the same day that he discovers that this man is now going to be a kind of surrogate father, is going to be standing in for his real father, and is going to take him away. It's not really explained because you are now destined to be super rich, but simply because now you have to have a different kind of upbringing. Understandably, young Charles Kane, this small boy, is baffled by this. He doesn't want to go. He wants to carry on playing in the snow. He doesn't understand why he has to leave home, and he hits the lawyer in the stomach with Rosebud. That's part of the significance of Rosebud. But the other person who doesn't understand it is his father. His father is shown during this scene saying to his wife, "Why does he have to go away? Why are you sending him away? I won't allow it. I refuse to allow it." Part of the setup here is it's not his money, it's his wife's money. It's an unusual situation for when we are. This is sometime in the mid-late 19th century. It is a Dickensian scene. It's her money, so she gets to call the shots. And in her exasperation, at one point, she says to her husband, basically, to get him away from you. That's why he has to go. Now, that seems to me the mystery in this film, and it's never fully explained. What's so terrible about the father? Has the father been abusing this boy? Is her son not safe with her husband, with his father? Or is he simply the wrong kind of man to be a father figure for someone who is going to be very wealthy. He seems to be a weak person. He's portrayed, even in these very few scenes, as weak and whiny. Maybe he's a drunk. But in getting her away from her husband, she also severs her tie with him herself. He loses his mother in losing his father. He loses his parents. It's not explained why. And the next time we see him, he's 25. And the man, the lawyer who's taken him away, who is ominously named, ominously for us, presumably not for Orson Welles, Thatcher, tells him at 25, now you're coming into your fortune. We're meant to believe he's had a fairly rickety intervening years. He's been to all sorts of fancy colleges and finishing schools and grand tours, and he's been expelled and run away. And he's become his own man, but he's not a reliable sort of person. If this was meant to turn him into a conventional person suitable for the inheritance of vast wealth, it hasn't worked. It's explained to him what he's inherited. And he says, I'm not interested in any of that. There's only one thing I'm interested in. I seem to have inherited a newspaper. And he's going to turn himself into a newspaper man. It's very clear early on in this film that it's going to be the story of someone who has been separated from the love of his parents. Now, by implication, there's something sinister about this love. Nonetheless, as a child, he is removed from his parents. And this is the stain, the Dickensian stain, that is going to spread through his life. It's going to darken everything. And I don't think it's a complicated reading of this film. It's there in the script at various moments to understand what's driving Kane is the search for the love that he has lost. Various people say to him at various times, you want everybody to love you. The problem is, they say, you don't love anyone in return. You're incapable of love, but it's the thing that you want. And we know why, because of what happened to him as a child. And you could also say that the theme of this film is that what Kane thinks he can do with his inheritance, the vast wealth that has just come to him, is to buy that love. And therefore the theme of this film is, in the words of the song, can't buy me love. It doesn't work. You can't buy love. But actually, I don't think that's true. I don't think that is true in this film, that Charles Foster Kane can't buy love. He can, and he does buy love. Successfully, he does buy love. Only certain very specific kinds of love can be bought. And that doesn't include the love of the women in his life, because I don't think that Charles Foster Kane is interested in being loved by the women in his life. He does seem to treat his wives as property, as things that he has accumulated and as extensions of himself. There is nothing loving about the relationships that he has in this film with women. So if that is where he's looking for love, it's a non-starter. But I don't think that is the love that he's trying to buy. I think he buys the women in a sense, but not for their love, for something else. The love that he tries to buy is the love of the people who work for him, of his employees at the newspaper. And he succeeds. So the earlier scenes in the film, set at the newspaper. It's a fictional newspaper, but based on a real New York newspaper. It's called the New York Inquirer. It's a newspaper that he inherits. It's a completely moribund, stuck in the past newspaper with a low circulation. And he turns it into a tabloid blockbuster of a newspaper with a massive circulation and huge notoriety. And he becomes notorious off the back of it. And the scenes set at the newspaper are full of the camaraderie of men, these are all men, almost all men, working for their boss and showering him with love. And it feels genuine. There is a real spirit that these people are loving it. He buys them. He buys these men. At one point, we're shown him standing outside the offices of the rival newspaper, and they have a photograph in their window of their world-famous team of writers, which is the reason why this is the best-selling newspaper in New York, because these amazing men, the best in their field, write for the paper that is Kane's rival. And in a seamless shot, we are shown that same group of men in that same pose for the photo in the offices of the New York Inquirer, because Kane has literally bought them, every single one of them, like they were sports players or something. He's just bought the other team and transplanted them to his newspaper. And they look euphoric, partly presumably because of the money, but my God, because it looks like a hell of a lot of fun. And the newspaper business, which was cutthroat, and it was a bit like sport or a game. It does look like a lot of fun, and there is a party that's thrown, and it is wild, it is ribald, and these men are loving it. And Kane loves it. You can feel in the film the energy that he gets from that kind of relationship with people who have been bought, who know they have been bought, who have been bought because they're the best at what they do, and they love it. And they kind of love the man who's bought them for that reason. At one point, Kane's first wife in the film more or less says, the other woman in our divorce is going to be the newspaper. It turns out there is another woman, and actually it's Kane's mistress who precipitates the divorce. But before she knows that, she is very conscious that her rival is not a woman. Her rival is the newspaper, because that's the thing, not only that Kane loves, but where he gets the love that he's looking for. So he's going out late at night to see the newspaper, and he comes home smelling of the newspaper. And when he's at home, when he should be talking to his wife, he is thinking about the newspaper, because the thing that he loves and is loved by is the newspaper, and he's bought it. The other kind of love that he thinks he can buy is the love of the readers of his newspaper. That is the love of, for want of a better phrase, the people, the ordinary people. Because this is a newspaper that speaks to the ordinary people. And eventually he acquires a whole host of newspapers across the country. He becomes a newspaper magnate with a vast readership. And he controls what these people read. And he thinks he can manipulate their emotions, that he can make them hate certain things and love certain things, that he can conjure up from these readers both love and hate. And he can, and he does. The character of Charles Foster Kane was based on the real newspaper and other kinds of tycoon of the era, William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst was notorious, among many other things, for not inventing, but really turbocharging a kind of journalism which was sometimes known as yellow journalism. Sensationalist, populist, manipulative, politically driven. And in the film, there are various scenes that clearly are meant to parallel events in the life of Hearst. Hearst was aware of this. Hearst was alive when Citizen Kane came out in 1941. He went out of his way to try and discredit the film, to try and block it being released, to rubbish it. He got his newspapers to rubbish the movie. He thought correctly that if people thought it was a portrait of him, it was a deeply unflattering portrait. It's not just Hearst, but it is mainly Hearst. One of the things that Hearst was notorious for was conjuring up, he would say patriotism, other people would say jingoism, but also war fever. In the second half of the 1890s, when the United States eventually went to war with Spain over some of Spain's colonies, the Hearst newspapers were beating the drum for war and manipulating public opinion, and with hindsight, a lot of it is highly manipulated, in order to create the impression that war was necessary. There is a scene in Citizen Kane in which he sent his journalists down to report on the outrages that have been committed by the Spanish, and they don't really find anything there, and they want to know, how are they meant to conjure up the mood for war. And Kane says to them, you provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war, which is a reference to, it may be apocryphal, it may be not, but the story that was told of Hearst of the Spanish-American War that his newspapers beat the drum for, that he said to his journalists, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Now, there's something completely fake and manipulative about this. This was fake news. But the emotions were real. The jingoism is fed by a real sense of outrage on the part of the readers. They hated the Spanish. They loved their brave boys who were going down to defend the rights of ordinary people. These emotions are both fake and also real, and they really can be manipulated. And that's what that kind of journalism did and does to this day. And that's what Kane in this film, like Hearst, reveals himself to be the master of. He understands better than anyone, probably better than the people who work for him, how to manipulate public opinion so that the people feel what you want them to feel. If the people feel it's fake, they won't feel it. If they feel they're being manipulated, they won't feel it. But if you can manipulate them successfully, they will feel it for real. But the love that Kane and indeed Hearst could not buy was the love of their newspaper readers for the men themselves, that is, for Kane, for Hearst. Because the thing that both the real Hearst and the fictional Charles Foster Kane wanted was the people who read their newspapers to vote for them into high public office. Hearst wanted a successful political career, and he ran for public office. He wanted to be president of the United States, and by implication, I think, Charles Foster Kane wants to be president of the United States. Hearst didn't get close. So the closest he ever got, the only elections he ever won in the early 1900s, were to the House of Representatives. He became a congressman, and he did it off the back of the support of the Democratic Party machine. Hearst and his fictional alter ego, Kane, are both Democrats. They are both representatives in their own mind of the common man. They were both, in a sense, populists, but also progressives in their own understanding of that word. Hearst got elected to Congress. But when he ran for mayor of New York, he lost, and he lost because he went up against the Democratic Party machine. And it turned out that his newspapers weren't enough, that the manipulation of public opinion in the way in which he specialized in it was not enough relative to the much harder, in a way more durable manipulation that was the specialism of the party bosses and the party machines. Not least, they knew how to get the vote out, they knew how to stuff the ballot boxes, and they knew how to prevent people from voting. He didn't get to be mayor of New York. He also ran to be governor of New York, and he didn't succeed in that either. He tried to get the Democratic Party nomination for president. All of this is early in the 20th century, and Hearst failed in all of that. He was blocked in all of those endeavors by the party machine. And the same story plays out in Citizen Kane, and the same fate befalls Citizen Kane. Charles Foster Kane runs in the movie to be governor of New York, and he tries to use his newspapers to take on the party machine and the corrupt party boss, who in this film is a man called Jim Geddes. He's going to take down Boss Geddes. He's going to take on, and this is Tammany Hall. By extension, Geddes was based on a real figure, Charles Murphy, who was the nemesis of William Randolph Hearst, the man that Hearst took on and was vanquished by. Kane is going to take on Jim Geddes, Boss Geddes, and he's going to expose him to the world, and the people are going to vote for him and not Geddes, because Kane and Kane's newspapers are going to show them just what a crook Geddes is and just how corrupt the party machine is. And as with Hearst, it doesn't work. So this sequence in the film has some weird parallels with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which after all was also a film about an individual trying to take on one of the party machines. In that film, it was Boss Taylor. In this film, it's Boss Geddes. And there are parallels here. So it's one man against the machine. And the way he's going to take on the machine is he's going to expose the machine. So just as Jefferson Smith makes his great speech in the Senate and he tells the world that Boss Taylor is corrupt and he exposes what he's up to, that's what Kane does too. We see this great speech that he makes in which he says, enough of this. I am going to take this man on. I'm going to jail him, he says. If I win this election, he's going to be in jail. But the parallels break down with the earlier movie very, very fast, because in almost every respect, it's nothing like that story. It's one man against the party machine, but the differences in this case are, first of all, Kane loses. Jefferson Smith wins. We don't know what happens after the movie ends, but he wins. Kane loses. As in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the tactic of the machine when it's attacked is to smear the man who's attacking it. So Jefferson Smith is accused of corruption and all sorts of documents are forged in order to show that you can't believe a word he says. Likewise, the response of Geddes to the attacks by Kane is to threaten Kane with the exposure of his relationship with his mistress. He is going to be smeared in all the rival newspapers, and the world is going to be told that, to use tabloid terminology, he's a love rat. And back in the early 20th century, that's thought to be a deal breaker. The difference is that it's true. It's not a smear. He is a love rat. This woman is his mistress, and Geddes has all the evidence. He's more or less tricked the woman into letting him know what's been going on. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the girl is his salvation. The girl is the person who gets him through. In this film, the girl is his destruction. But though it's one man against the machine, it's not every man. It is Charles Foster Kane. He's the wealthy, powerful newspaper magnate. He thinks he's more powerful than the machine he's taking on. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jefferson Smith holds the floor of the Senate. He holds the stage. He goes to a place, this grand place, and though he's a nobody, he manages to get on the platform and hold it long enough to break his opponents. Citizen Kane builds the stage. He owns the stage. It's his platform because he has literally constructed it. We see in an amazing sequence the rally, the speech. It looks a little like a fascist rally, and it's this vast production paid for with Kane money. All of it is paid for with his money. He has built the platform on which he stands to denounce his enemies. And in that sense, it is a kind of sham. And he is reminded repeatedly throughout the film by various of his sidekicks that the thing that he wants, which is to be the representative of the common man, to speak for these people and to have them love him in return, isn't going to work. Not only because he's not one of them, he's far too rich, he's far too wealthy, he doesn't really understand them. Not only because, in a way, he's setting himself up as their sugar daddy. He says at what point, yeah, I know I'm rich, I know I'm powerful, I know I'm not like ordinary people, but if I don't speak for them, someone who's not rich and powerful will. And so by extension, it's more responsible for someone like me to speak for them because I can control them. And he's reminded that's not going to wash it with the people you speak for. In the end, they're going to find people to speak for them who are like them or who at least understand them. And when he says he's going to take on the Democratic Party machine, one of his sidekicks says to him, one, you're going to lose, but two, you're never going to win anyway, because you may not be aware of this, but there's another force at work in the world now, and by now we're in the second decade of the 20th century. It's called the labor movement, the labor unions. These people now have organizations to speak for them for themselves. So you might think you're standing up for them and for their rights and for their jobs and for their pay packets. But now they've got people to stand up for them who are them. They're doing it for themselves. You are never going to win that fight. In Citizen Kane, there is a scene at the heart of the movie where Kane and Geddes confront each other in the apartment in which Kane has installed his mistress. And his wife is there too. All four of them are in the same room. It is agony for all of them in different ways. But Geddes makes it clear to Kane that if he doesn't withdraw from the race to be governor, he will expose him, he will expose this relationship, and he will ruin him. And he says to him, go home to your wife who is here. Your political career is over, and you do the decent thing, admit you've been defeated. And Kane's response is very Trumpian. He says no. He won't go home with his wife. He tells his wife to go home and he stays with his mistress. He says effectively to Geddes, publish and be damned. I'm not going to back down. I never back down. He knows it'll probably ruin him, but he says, I'm going to take you on and I'm still going to do my damnedest to defeat you. He fights the election even though the newspapers have run this story exposing him. And he does lose. And when he loses, in another Trumpian moment, a celebrated scene in the film, we see in his own newspaper the two mock-up front pages that have been prepared for election night, depending on how it plays out. There is still hope by these men who still, it is clear, love their boss, that he's going to win. So they have one front page mocked up which says Kane triumphs. But when the news comes in that he's 1 million votes behind and there is no way to make those votes up, by implication even with stuffed ballot boxes, they say we're going to have to run with the other front page. And they peel it off and they hold it up and it says fraud at polls. He never admits defeat. If he wins, he's won. If he loses, he's been robbed. And yet there is one aspect of what he does next, which I think is nothing like Donald Trump. And it's where the Kane story and the Trump story part ways, not least because, amazing as it still is, unlike Charles Foster Kane, Donald J. Trump did become president of the United States. Kane's political career is effectively ended at that moment, and he recognizes it too, as Hearst did. Hearst tried, he failed, and eventually he gave up. He couldn't defeat the machine, and Kane recognizes the same. But on another level, he refuses to give up. When Trump is exposed, He refuses to accept defeat because he refuses to accept the terms on which he's been exposed. He refuses to accept that he's going to play the game on anyone's terms other than his own. If they impose certain standards on him, he will just repudiate those standards. He's not interested in what they say about him. Kane wants to force the world to accept him on the world's terms. He wants to force people who effectively know he's a liar and a bully and a fraud and a charlatan, nonetheless, to admit that he's a gentleman. Even though he knows and they know it's a lie, he still wants them to say, you are not what we know you are what we respect and we admire. I don't think Trump has that motivation in him. I don't think he needs to be respected and admired on the world's terms. He wants the world to respect and admire him on his terms. And I think in a way that's his strength. It's one of the reasons why he's shameless. Charles Foster Kane is also shameless, but he is determined after his exposure to prove his exposers wrong. And the thing on which it turns, it's a tiny thing, but it is then the key to the whole of the second half of the film. When he's exposed as a love rat and the rival tabloids run their stories about him, they describe him as being in a relationship with, in their headlines, a singer, because he is in a relationship with a woman who would like to be a singer. But they put the word singer in quote marks, a quote unquote singer. By implication, she's not a singer. We know what she is. We can't use the word for what she is in a family newspaper. She would like us to describe her as a singer, so we'll call her a quote unquote singer. And as one of the characters says of Charles Kane, he spends the next years of his life and much of his fortune trying to force them to remove the quote marks from the word singer. That is, to force them to accept that she really is a singer. So she is a singer, but she's a kind of nightclub crooner. But he is determined to turn her into the world's greatest opera star, which is ridiculous because she really isn't. She really isn't that sort of singer. But if he can force them to accept that she really is that sort of singer, in his mind, he will have forced them to admit that they were wrong. He can't get them to admit he wasn't having a relationship with her, so he marries her. That's the other thing that he does, which I think is not strictly Trumpian. He marries her, and then he spends the next few years of his life building her an opera house, the Chicago Opera House, and paying the world's best opera trainers to train her up to be a great opera singer, and then paying funding for these elaborate productions. And it is agony to watch. It's not that she can't sing. She can hold a note, I think. I'm no judge of that. It's not that she can't sing, but she can't sing like that. She can't sing to the world's highest standards so that the world will admit that whatever else she is, she's definitely a singer. And because he controls newspapers, he also makes sure that in every town that she appears, there are rave reviews saying that this great new star has arrived on the opera scene. Everyone knows it's a lie. He knows it's a lie. She knows it's a lie, his wife, and it is agony for her. As she says to him at one point, you have no idea what it's like going out there night after night, knowing what they really think about me. But he doesn't care. It's not about them really thinking that she's great, but it's about them admitting that they will not deny that she's great because he has forced it down their throats. And he can't do it. He can't do it. And in the end, the person who breaks is his wife. She can't go out there anymore. And the other person who breaks is Kane himself. In another celebrated, unforgettable scene in the film, his friend, his great friend, a character called Jedediah Leland, who has been with him through his newspaper years and is a man from whom I think he at one time got the kind of love that he was searching. This is a genuine friendship. But he's also acquired him in some way. And he works with him in the newspapers, but in the end they fall out because Kane is an impossible man to live with and work with. And Jedediah Leland goes off to Chicago, and he's the drama critic of Kane's newspaper there. And the two men haven't spoken, but there is going to be a night where this man, who was Kane's friend, is going to have to review the performance of Kane's wife, his second wife. Susan Alexander Kane is her name. They have the music critic all lined up to say it's a great production. They have the art critic lined up to say it looks amazing. The music critic will say the singing is magnificent, but they also need the drama critic to at least say that she's also a great actress too, and he can't do it. And everyone knows what's coming here. Jedediah Leland, once Charles Kane's dearest friend, will not be able to put his name to a review that says the second Mrs. Kane can act. And Kane arrives at the newspaper, finds Leland drunk, because by this point he's also drinking away his grief and his sorrow, and finds the half-written review saying she was awful. And he sort of says, it's not for me to comment on what the music critic and the art critic are going to say, but my God, this woman can't act. It's embarrassing. And Kane rips the review out of the typewriter and takes it over to another typewriter, shoves it in and starts finishing the review. And the assumption of everyone is that he's rewriting it to say that she was wonderful, she was magnificent, but he doesn't. He finishes the review in the spirit in which it was begun, and he finishes it by saying she was terrible. And he publishes it in his own newspaper. And we see him and his wife the next day, and she is screaming at him, the least that this whole enterprise was meant to involve was your newspapers saying that I'm great. How am I meant to go out there and do this if even one of your newspapers says that I can't act? And she shrieks at him. And it is a kind of mystery. Why has he finished this? And the journalist who's looking for the ultimate mystery, in the terms of the film, Who or What is Rosebud, is speaking to the elderly Leland and says, why did he do it? Why did he finish your review? And Leland more or less says, because he was trying to prove to me that he was capable of telling the truth. I used to be his friend, and he still had something to prove to me. He wanted to force me to accept that despite everything, despite the fact his life has now become a giant sham, this is still a man who knows what the truth is. Even though, obviously, both Leland and Kane know that it's not true that Charles Foster Kane is a man who tells the truth. Charles Foster Kane is a liar. He's built his whole reputation, his business, such as it is, on lies. He's a manipulator of human emotion. That means he's a liar. But he doesn't want to persuade Leland that he's a truth teller. He just wants to force Leland to accept it as though it were true. That's all he's trying to do. It's enough just to make them bite their tongues. And he can't do it. Leland won't accept it. The world will not bite its tongue about what a terrible singer this woman is. And in the end, she won't bite her tongue either. And she refuses to go out and sing anymore. And then in the end, though he has built her this absurd palace called Xanadu, which is based on the absurd palace that Hearst built in California, this one is in Florida, San Simeon in California, Xanadu in Florida. Hearst knew he was being mocked. Even though he's built her this pleasure dome, she can't bear it. And she leaves him and she winds up as a nightclub singer. And he dies alone, surrounded by all of his meaningless accumulated possessions. It's an amazing film. It is a deeply political film, and its theme, its story has politics running all the way through it. Hearst, like Kane, once he had stopped being a progressive man of the people, became a different kind of man of the people, and through the 30s and into the early 40s, he was a fascist sympathizer of a sort. He was certainly an American firster, deeply suspicious of getting embroiled in this war against Hitler. It's also an amazing film simply for the fact that Orson Welles was only 26 when he made it, and Welles's performance is unbelievable. He doesn't age completely convincingly. He's not a completely convincing old man, but he's an amazingly convincing middle-aged man for a 26-year-old. When he's playing Kane as a kind of burnt-out, rotten 40-something, he looks exactly like that's what he is. The film is also celebrated for some of its formal innovations in the way that Kane directed it. Each shot is perfectly framed, and perhaps most famously of all, many of the shots are from the ground up. So many of the scenes in various rooms are looking at the characters from the floor so that they look larger than life. And in various of these scenes, Kane himself, Welles, looms enormous. He was a big man, but he's like a cartoon giant. He was, we're meant to believe, and this is reinforcing it through the visual imagery, a larger-than-life man. He was all about occupying all of the space in any room that he entered. And you really see it, and you see it, and you feel it. He's got an amazing booming voice when he gives his speech. He's a magnificent orator in a way, as Wells was. He is this dominating presence. And you look up at him through the film, particularly at the height of his powers, such as they were. And he really does, he takes over your field of vision. But the other thing that it feels like as you are seeing him and the other characters too from the floor up, their feet are bigger, their legs are bigger, and they loom over you, is that it's like a child-eyes view of these men and women, but particularly the men in the newspaper scenes and in some of the key scenes in the film where he has these confrontations in which he tries to assert his power and his ability to control the environment in which he is in. And he is immensely powerful and ultimately completely frustrated. And we see this as though we were a child. I don't think that Charles Foster Kane in this film is portrayed as a childlike adult. He has some childish appetites, I suppose, and he is impulsive. He has a certain kind of infantile impulsiveness. But actually, I don't think he's a childish character at all. He really is an adult. He is fully formed. He is this enormous creature out in the world. We only see him as a child, and then when he's 25, and even by the time he's 25, this man is grown up. But it's like a child's imagination of what a grown-up is. So he is an adult. He is this huge figure. But it's sort of like what a child would think an adult could do if an adult had money and power in the world. Assert himself, get what he wants, buy the love he needs, accumulate more and more possessions. It's not childish in itself. It is too cynical, and he's too much in control of it in a way. He doesn't actually, in the end, until very near the end and his wife leaves him, break down in impulsive chaos. He holds himself together even when he loses at the polls, even when his dreams are shattered, even when he reads the terrible review of his wife's performance. He holds himself together. He doesn't break. But it's still like what a child might imagine an adult would do in those circumstances, which feels like it is part of the theme of the film, taking it back to the beginning. It's not like his childhood was frozen at the moment he was taken away from his parents and he is still acting out as the child. He doesn't act out. He is not an actor out in that sense. He is a very controlled performer, an actor. But whatever was frozen in him then is a vision of what he's going to do when he's an adult. And that's then what he does. And that is the root of his failure. It's a child's version of an adult life. And it is weirdly the inversion of Wells's own life. So what happened to Orson Welles was the opposite of what happened to Charles Foster Kane. Wells's mother died when he was young, leaving him in the care of his father. And maybe what's going on, what explains the mystery at the start of Citizen Kane, when we are not told why, but we are simply told that this boy needs to be taken away from his father, is that Wells himself was left in the care of a man who was incapable of caring for him. His father was a drunk. He was clearly a charismatic man, but he was deeply unreliable. And in Wells's early years, his early teenage years in particular, he traveled with his father when he was 13, when he was 14. And he said subsequently that rather than being looked after by his father, he looked after his father on these madcap adventures that they went on. And he was forced to grow up very, very quickly. And what he became was an incredibly precocious child. In fact, what he became was, quite early on, a child who had to be an adult, had to behave like an adult. So by the time Orson Welles was 13 or 14, he was effectively living as an adult in a child's body, which is almost the opposite of what we see with Kane, who is in an adult's body, but is still doing the things that he might have thought he would have been able to do in an adult's body when he was a child. And if anyone's life fits the pattern of an extraordinary rise and a modest fall, it's not Kane, it's Wells. Wells did then have an extraordinary rise through his late teens, but then in his early 20s, through to Citizen Kane, appearing in 1941, a film he made when he was 26. And though it wasn't at the time quite recognized as the greatest film ever made, my God, people knew that they were in the presence of genius when that film came out. And he never quite lived up to it again. It wasn't a precipitate failure after that. He still did some amazing things, made some amazing films, remained famous, world famous, lived an extraordinary life. The fall was never complete, but after the amazing rise, there was a steady and modest fall. He had to grow up far too quickly. He did amazing things with the powers that he acquired as a kind of child adult. And then he didn't know what to do with them. And though he didn't squander his gifts, he never lived up to the promise of what he did when he was 26 because it couldn't be lived up to. There was nothing he could do to top that. And so his life, it just gently declines, as Trump describes Kane's life doing, even though Kane's life did nothing like that. Orson Welles says of Citizen Kane, it is the story of a man's failure. And that's what it is. Welles's life was not a failure, but Welles's life was a modest fall. Kane, Hearst, in the end, those lives were failure on almost every level. They inherited their wealth. They didn't blow all of it, but they blew most of it on vanity projects. Their politics by the end were toxic and wrong. I don't think Welles was under any illusions in 1941 that Hearst's politics were wrong. So where is Trump in this story? I don't know. I think I understand why Citizen Kane is Trump's favorite film. I think I have some understanding of what he sees in it, but also what he sees in it is clearly wrong. But here is perhaps the greatest 26-year-old filmmaker of them all, one of the greatest 26-year-old artists of them all, who never tops that. And here is the story of a fictional man based on the life of a real man, Kane, Hearst. Both of them wanted to be president of the United States. Neither of them got anywhere near. And then here's this man, Trump. I don't think he identified with the life of Orson Welles, so that's the life that he thinks is being told in Citizen Kane. So he's read the film almost backwards, back to front. But he did end up as president of the United States, which means whatever else you might want to say about Donald J. Trump, he is not Charles Foster Kane. I don't know whether this is appropriate to say after what I've just been talking about or not. Maybe this is in the spirit of conspicuous consumption and mindless accumulation. But I just wanted to remind you that there is PPF merchandise now available. We have an ethically sourced canvas tote bag and we have bone china mugs. We think they look lovely and we think you'll like them. Just go either to our website or to the LRB's website and you can see how to buy them. Next time in our series about the great political films, I'm going to be talking about a film that was made 2 years after Citizen Kane. So these are 4 films, each made 2 years apart. And the next one is a British film, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, made right at the heart of the Second World War. It has many things in common with La Grande Illusion. It actually has 1 or 2 things in common with Citizen Kane, but it is also unique. Do join me for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.